You're almost asleep when, without warning, that scene comes back. A sentence said the wrong way. An awkward silence afterward. Someone's face changing for half a second. Maybe it happened 8 years ago. Maybe no one else remembers it anymore. But your body remembers. Your chest tightens. You turn over on your pillow. You mentally try to correct what you said, as if there were still some chance to go back into that room and erase everything. The shame returns in full force. And then comes the most absurd part. Yesterday, you walked into a room and forgot what you had gone there to get. You can't remember where you left your keys. You might not even be able to recall what you had for lunch. But that old useless mistake, buried in a day that has already disappeared, is still alive. Why? The usual explanation is that you think too much, that you're insecure, that you need to learn to leave the past behind. But that doesn't explain why the embarrassing memory feels so clear while recent events simply vanish. It also doesn't explain why your body reacts before you even decide to think about it. Maybe your mind isn't replaying that scene because it was important in the way you imagine. Maybe it's replaying it because, to an ancient part of the brain, forgetting a social mistake could cost much more than forgetting where an object was. Here is the dark truth. Your memory was not shaped to record life fairly. It was shaped to prioritize anything that could threaten your place among other people. And to understand why a distant embarrassment can still travel through the years and find you in the dark, we need to go back to a world where reputation was not just about discomfort. It was protection, belonging, survival. Come back with me to a world where the idea of a stranger had a completely different meaning. There are no cities, locked doors, or anonymous crowds. There is a stretch of land, a few dozen familiar faces, and the certainty that your life depends on those people. Here, disappearing from the group does not mean loneliness. It can mean death. Imagine the end of an afternoon. The light is fading. The fire has not been lit yet, and someone returns from the forest empty-handed. That person ignored a warning, wandered too far away, and forced 2 members of the group to search for them. No one shouts, but the looks change. The person notices. That tension is more than embarrassment. In a small group where everyone knows who shares food, who protects the children, and who runs away when danger appears, reputation works like invisible armor. Being seen as careless, selfish, or unpredictable can reduce the help, trust, and protection you receive when you need them. That is why the brain does not treat shame as a minor social detail. It marks it as a warning. The scene needs to hurt so it will not be repeated. The faces of the others need to remain engraved in your mind. The silence after the mistake needs to return during the night. Not to torture someone, but to teach a rule. Do not threaten your place in the group. Now imagine that, days later, this person forgets where they left a useful stone or which root they collected. That is frustrating. But forgetting the action that nearly broke the group's trust would be very different. A lost object can be replaced. A damaged reputation can turn allies into observers, and observers into people who do not come closer when night falls. In that world, memory does not need to keep every detail. It needs to choose. The path taken, the smell of smoke, the expression of disapproval, the laugh that came after a mistake. Some memories are fragile because they do not change the future. Others become heavier because they seem to predict who will be beside you tomorrow. And there is something even more disturbing. To correct a social mistake, it is not enough to remember that it happened. You need to reconstruct it. Where you were, who saw it, which word came out wrong. When the mood changed, the mind returns to the scene because it is searching for the difference between belonging and being pushed away. This is how rumination starts to seem less absurd. Replaying a humiliating moment could reveal the missed signal, the broken rule, or the invisible boundary. The pain kept the event available, like a mark along the path. It did not simply say, "That was bad." It said, "Pay attention, because next time you may not get another chance." But there was a price. A system built to protect belonging did not carefully distinguish between a serious mistake and an awkward moment. When the group's reaction was uncertain, the brain preferred to exaggerate. It was safer to carry shame for too long than to ignore a threat to your position. That is why the old scene did not disappear when the danger passed. It remained like an unfinished simulation, ready to be opened again. The past was revisited not because the brain enjoyed suffering, but because it was still searching for a way to stop the same thing from happening again. The group sleeps. The fire grows weaker. But inside someone, the scene stays lit. And this is where the most fascinating part begins. This system did not stay in the past. It is still running inside your brain right now. This is how it works. When an embarrassing memory appears, you imagine that you are simply remembering an old event. But the brain does not store experiences like untouched videos. It reconstructs fragments, sensations, and meanings. And when the meaning involves a social threat, that reconstruction receives much more priority than neutral details from everyday life. First step, something triggers the memory. It could be a word, an expression, a quiet room, or simply the moment when your attention slows down. You do not choose to open the memory. A similar detail works like a key, and the brain fills in the rest before you even realize what happened. At that moment, the amygdala helps evaluate whether the content deserves urgent attention. It is not a button used only for fear, but it plays a role in detecting emotional importance. If that scene involved humiliation, rejection, or the risk of being judged, the brain may treat it as information that still needs to be carefully monitored. At the same time, areas connected to memory, such as the hippocampus, help reconstruct the context. Where you were, who was nearby, and what happened before. But intense emotions do not preserve every detail accurately. They may strengthen the threatening center of the experience while leaving the edges blurry, incomplete, or even distorted. That is why you may not remember what anyone was wearing, but you remember perfectly how it felt to have everyone looking at you. Emotional memory does not need to be an exact recording to produce an exact alarm. It only needs to preserve the main impression. In that moment, your social position seemed to fall, even if it was only for a few seconds. Second step, the brain compares that scene with the present. This comparison does not happen like a calm analysis. It is fast, automatic, and based on similarities. A neutral comment today may remind you of someone's tone in the past. A silence now may reopen the old doubt. Did I do something wrong again? When this happens, the autonomic nervous system may react before you reach any conscious conclusion. Your breathing changes, your muscles tighten, and your face becomes warm. Your body receives the message that you are socially exposed, even though you are alone in bed. The physical sensation turns a distant memory into what feels like a present danger. Here is a crucial detail. Strong emotion increases the feeling that something is true. If the body reacts intensely, the mind concludes that the memory must be important. This creates a cycle. The memory causes discomfort. The discomfort seems to confirm danger, and that confirmation makes the memory easier to retrieve later. Third step. The negativity bias comes into play. In simple terms, the brain tends to give more weight to threatening information than to neutral or pleasant events. This does not mean that every person is pessimistic. It means that, throughout evolution, ignoring danger cost more than ignoring a moment of safety. Forgetting where you left an object yesterday usually does not threaten your identity. Forgetting an event that seems to teach you how to avoid rejection may be placed in a different category. For the brain, the question is not, which memory is more recent? The question is, which memory could stop me from suffering again? But one piece is still missing. Why does the mind repeat the scene instead of simply storing it? Because remembering can also work as a simulation. The default mode network, which becomes active when attention turns inward, is involved in thoughts about ourselves, other people, the past, and imagined futures. When you relive the shame, your mind may be trying to answer questions that were left open. What did they think? Should I have stayed quiet? How can I avoid this next time? It feels like punishment, but there is a hidden attempt to gain control. Reviewing the past creates the illusion that the future will become predictable, but each repetition may also strengthen the path that leads to the memory. Not because the brain wants to preserve it, but because anything that is retrieved becomes active again. When you remember, you reconstruct. When you reconstruct, you add your current emotion. Then, you store a modified version of that already distant experience once again. This is where memory becomes even less like a camera. Every reopened memory can go through small changes. Today's feelings mix with yesterday's event. You may begin to remember not only what happened, but also every time you suffered while thinking about it alone. This helps explain why the scene seems to grow over the years. The event may have lasted 20 seconds. The memory, however, received hours of attention, interpretation, and physical reactions. Over time, its weight no longer comes only from what happened. It comes from the number of times it was relived. Meanwhile, what you did yesterday may not have received enough attention to become firmly stored. Recent memories depend on repetition, meaning, sleep, and context. If the day passed automatically, broken up by distractions, many experiences leave no deep mark. They happened, but the brain received no clear reason to preserve them. The old shame has exactly what recent daily life does not have: emotion, threat, identity, and social importance. It touches the most sensitive question in the social brain: do I still belong? That is why a small mistake can compete unfairly with dozens of recent facts and easily win every time. But this does not mean that every embarrassing memory contains a useful lesson. The system was built to detect risks, not to judge them fairly. It can mark a verbal mistake as if it were banishment, an uncertain laugh as contempt, and an ordinary silence as proof of approaching social rejection. So far, this explains why the old memory receives priority, why the body reacts, and why the mind repeats the scene. But it still does not explain why this mechanism feels so difficult to turn off today. To understand that, we need to look at the environment that has learned how to trigger it constantly. And now comes the part almost no one notices. The mechanism that preserves your shame is not working alone. It has found an environment capable of offering new triggers all day long. The modern world does not simply remind you of your mistakes. It creates the conditions for the brain to keep reopening, comparing, and updating something that should have lost its importance. In a small ancestral community, a social mistake happened in front of only a few people. Afterward, the group needed to hunt, care for others, travel, and sleep. Life pushed attention toward real threats. Today, the scene may end, but its echoes remain in photographs, saved conversations, profiles, notifications, and faces that reappear on the screen without being invited. You open a social network to answer a message. Then you see someone who was there that night. There is no accusation, comment, or sign of judgment. There is only a face. Even so, the memory returns in full, as if the brain were saying, before we continue, we need to check again what this meant. This is the first conflict. The brain was prepared for rare social signals, but now it lives surrounded by artificial reminders. In the past, someone's face appeared because the person was physically nearby. Now it can appear hundreds of times, without context, compressed onto a screen, and connected to numbers that seem to measure acceptance. A like is not food. A view is not protection. A cold comment is not banishment. But the system that monitors reputation works with clues, not definitions. It notices a lack of response, reduced attention, and differences in status. Then it tries to turn unclear signals into predictions about belonging. And there is a second conflict. In the ancestral environment, you mostly compared yourself with people whose entire lives you could observe. You saw their strength and skill, but also their tiredness, failure, illness, and fear. Today, you compare your private reality with selected moments from hundreds of people. The brain sees the result without seeing the editing. Then, an old embarrassment receives new fuel. You remember a bad presentation and see someone speaking confidently. You remember a rejection and see smiling couples. You relive an awkward sentence and watch people who seem socially perfect. None of those images mentions your past, but each comparison can reactivate the same conclusion. I failed where everyone else seems to succeed. The problem becomes worse when the day grows quiet. For hours, your attention was broken up by messages, videos, tasks, and alerts. When you finally lie down, the outside stimulation decreases. Your mind finds space to process what was left unfinished, and the most emotional memory usually arrives first. That is why the memory seems to attack exactly when you are trying to rest. It does not mean it was hiding and waiting for the night. It means the brain lost the distractions that were keeping it away from the center of your attention. The same technology that occupied your mind all day may leave behind a line of unprocessed emotions at the end. There is an even crueler detail. The imagined audience has become enormous. A mistake made in front of 3 people can be relived as if everyone had witnessed it. Social media has trained the brain to expect the possibility of permanent exposure. Even when nothing was posted, the mind creates audiences, comments, and judgments that may never have existed. In a meeting, you pronounce a word incorrectly and notice a pause. On public transportation, you think someone looked at your clothes. In a group chat, you send something and no one answers immediately. These are different events, but the alarm can place them in the same category. The risk of looking unsuitable in front of the tribe. The modern world adds volume, speed, and uncertainty to a system that prefers caution. There are more faces, more comparisons, and more unexplained signals. Shame never receives a clear conclusion. It receives new pieces of incomplete evidence, and the brain keeps trying to solve a case that may never have existed outside its own interpretation. And here comes the deciding question. If the memory is not a sentence, but an alarm amplified by an environment that never offers silence, what should you do when that scene returns? The answer is not to erase the past or argue with every thought. It is to recognize something the brain cannot notice on its own. The threat has ended, but the mechanism is still searching for a tribe that is no longer there. When that scene returns, your first reaction may be to treat it as proof. Proof that you were ridiculous, that everyone noticed, and that something about you is still wrong. But this is the mechanism's final trap, confusing intensity with accuracy. The memory feels true because the body reacts, and the body reacts because the memory was marked as important. That does not mean it contains a secret message you need to examine until you find the perfect answer. Often, the brain is not offering wisdom. It is simply running an ancient routine. Detect a social threat, reconstruct the mistake, and practice a way to stop it from happening again. The system keeps working even when there is nothing left to correct. The practical solution begins in a very small space. The moment the shame appears, before you enter the imaginary courtroom again, you can name what is happening. This is a memory of a social threat, not a present emergency. The sentence does not erase the feeling. It simply gives your conscious mind a few seconds to review the alarm. Next, try to separate the event from the interpretation. The event may be simple. I said something, there was a pause, and someone looked away. The interpretation usually grows later. Everyone thought I was incompetent. No one forgot, and this revealed who I really am. The brain joins these 2 layers together and presents them as if they were one fact. Separating them is not positive thinking. It is accuracy. You do not need to replace the memory with a more comforting version. You only need to recognize where the observable details end and where the ancient prediction of exclusion begins. A strong feeling may show that the system detected something important. It does not prove that the imagined judgment happened or that it is still happening. There is also value in changing the question. Instead of asking, "How could I have done that?" ask, "What danger does my brain believe it is still preventing?" The first question opens an endless trial. The second reveals the mechanism. Maybe it is trying to protect your reputation, acceptance, or sense of control. When the mechanism has a name, the memory loses part of its disguise. It stops being a voice from the past announcing a truth about you and becomes the echo of a protective system. The echo may still be painful. It may still appear in the dark. But now there is an essential difference. You understand that standing in front of an alarm does not mean you are standing in front of the danger that created it. This is the most uncomfortable and, at the same time, the most freeing realization. You do not relive that shame because the past is still demanding punishment. You relive it because a brain built to survive among a small number of familiar faces learned that forgetting social mistakes could be dangerous. The world changed. The record remained. And urgency was mistaken for truth. That is why the way out does not begin by trying to defeat the memory in an argument. It begins by realizing that it is a suggestion of danger, not a verdict. You can hear it without obeying its conclusion. You can recognize the physical reaction without turning it into evidence. You can allow your conscious cortex to do something the ancient alarm cannot do on its own. Consider context, distance, proportion, and change. You may never erase some scenes, but you can stop treating them like messages sent from the present. They are old maps, drawn for a territory that no longer exists. If this investigation made you see your mind in a different way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Here, we reveal the ancient mechanisms that still control modern behavior. Not to blame the brain, but to recognize when it is trying to survive a danger that has already passed.